The following is a project of our nonprofit newsroom. Support Midcoast Morning and local community-centered journalism today by signing up to be a monthly sustaining donor at chly.ca/donate. It doesn't take much money to support local news.
Hello and welcome to Midcoast Morning. I'm Joe Pugh. Islands Trust Council has approved its budget for the year, following a quarterly meeting that took place in Nanaimo last week. Among this year's projects is a review of Gabriola Island's official community plan. The Islands Trust is a special form of government serving Gulf Islands in the Salish Sea. It was created by provincial legislation in the 1970s with a mandate to preserve and protect the environment and unique amenities of the Gulf Islands. If you caught the show last week, you would have heard groups expressing concern about Trust Council's interpretation of their mandate. Today on the show, we'll hear a conversation with Gabriola Island Trustee Tobi Elliot. We'll touch on Trust Council's work this year on Gabriola, issues affecting the island, and Elliot's response to the concerns raised on last week's show.
Well, good morning. I'm Tobi Elliot, a resident of Gabriola Island, and I'm an elected trustee, so I'm a member of the local trust committee, which is part of the Islands Trust governing body in the Gulf Islands. I'm also a vice chair, and that means I'm on the executive and I chair other local trust areas, so Maine, South Pender, and Thetis and Lasqueti Islands, and I get to sit on those committees and make decisions with their community. Yeah, I'm also sitting on the board of the Conservancy of the Islands Trust, so I wear quite a few different hats, but Gabriola is my home and where I'm very proud and privileged to make decisions with my community.
And last week you were here in Nanaimo for the Islands Trust quarterly meeting over 3 days. Coming out of that, the Islands Trust Council announced that it approved this year's budget. And one of the major items highlighted there was that this year Gabriola Island's official community plan and land use bylaw, there's going to be a comprehensive review project. I expect we'll be spending a lot of time talking about that today. How would you maybe introduce that for listeners?
Well, thanks for that. Yes, 3 days of Trust Council meetings. We have to get through a lot of business, but the critical piece for March Trust Council is passing the budget. So we are mandated to pass a budget by March 31st of every year, and that goes to the Ministry of Municipal Affairs for approval. So big piece of business we had to get done. I believe our budget was sitting around $11 million for the 2024-25 year. And that money is allocated across, well, we've got 13 local trust areas and multiple islands. Some of them have their own OCPs. And so Gabriola, for instance, our community of 4,500 people, we haven't updated or reviewed our OCP significantly since 1997. So we're working on some outdated policies that were set with really good intentions, but we're quite challenged with some of the bylaws that just don't fit the community needs for today and certainly going into the future. So we've been waiting for an OCP review for a long time, and sort of with bated breath, my co-trustee Susan Yates and I were sitting there going, "Oh, are our fellow trustees going to allow this to pass?" And it did. In fact, all the local trust committee projects passed. They're really critical for their communities, and so we want to protect those in the budget. So it was quite a conversation. There was a few big picture or big pieces that folks were challenged to pass. I was very pleased with the a full-time conservancy position. We've been the Islands Trust Conservancy is a big part of accomplishing the mandate of the Islands Trust to protect and preserve the islands and the ecosystems. And we just didn't have enough staff capacity to manage all the properties that have been donated or put covenants on. And so there's a full-time equivalent team leader now who can help with that work. So it was a great process, lots of good conversation, but coming out of it, I feel Gabriola won with getting our water balance project approved and the OCP review.
So the official community plan, the OCP, being updated for the first time in more than 25 years. Can you give listeners a sense of how a document like that, changing, being updated, turns into changes that people living on Gabriola Island notice in their day-to-day lives?
Yes. I think the most critical piece is that First Nations reconciliation and considering First Nations interests in our OCPs isn't a deeply thought out part, and it really needs to be a foundational part for all of our land use planning. On Gabriola Island, Nanaimo First Nation has treaty lands that will be transferred from the provincial government, and they've got plans for the 1,000 acres there. And so working with Nanaimo in terms of how land is developed and managed, and more critically, where do we put increased housing? If our community of Gabriola needs more housing options, we have to have some science-based or evidence-based data for where do we put that housing. And so we can talk about water in a little bit, because that's one of the critical lenses to decide how to increase housing. So as we work towards a future where Nanaimo people and Gabriola Islanders are going to be living together, we have to have those conversations about land use, density, housing, and how to protect the resources, especially fresh water in the islands. So updating affordable housing, we don't have a lot of options for people who are struggling with housing. The rental market is very poor. There's lots of big, single-family dwellings where people have moved. It's been sort of a vacation spot. And some of those little old cabins that, from the 1960s, that's something that I lived in when I first moved to Gabriola. They're demolished and they're no longer rental units. So we don't have condos or apartment buildings for folks. And so people who have lived on Gabriola for decades don't have a lot of options, and we need to think through how to provide housing options for those members of our community.
So a lot of what you talked about there regarding housing options and a lack of housing would be pretty applicable, I think it's fair to say, to a lot of communities in BC. How does being a Gulf island and being part of the Islands Trust impact that conversation?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, the reason a special purpose government was set up for the islands is because the provincial government back in the 1970s decided we have unique amenities. We have special features in the islands that are different. One of those special features is water. So groundwater is plentiful in some areas and very poor in other areas. We don't have big mountains, which, and watersheds that direct water from large catchment areas. We've got sandstone and very porous kind of rocky substrate that water just runs out into the ocean. So understanding where water flows, this is one of the critical unique amenities for the Gulf Islands. And since I think 2019, the Islands Trust has had a strategic initiative to understand freshwater resources and have a sustainability plan for the whole trust area. Gabriola Island is quite unique, and the reason we got approved for a special project to do a water balance methodology is because we have a lot of data from the RDN. There's monitoring wells around Gabriola that the province manages to determine how much water is in the substrate or the ground, but we don't have any data about where the water is flowing and the water out. Where is it being used? Is it in agriculture, and where it's flowing over the surface into the ocean? So when we're looking at increasing housing, or where do we need to maybe decrease housing because there isn't available water, you've got to have a methodology that's based on science. And so partnering with the RDN, Regional District of Nanaimo, they've got a watershed plan for all their other areas, but not for Area B, Gabriola. That's our job as the Islands Trust. And they're quite excited to partner with our water scientist, senior freshwater specialist, William Schulba, to do this methodology so that we can better understand where the water recharge areas are, where the land can handle more increased housing, and where we should not put it.
And so that is happening this year with the goal of informing what we've been talking about earlier, updates to the official community plan.
Exactly. So determining the water demand of communities, the water needs of ecosystems, and the amount of water runoff is really critical. We actually have a lot of groundwater on Gabriola, but it's literally just running off into the ocean. There's no catchment areas because it's all sandstone, and there's some ponds, but they dry up. So we could have a water management plan that's equivalent to an aquifer watershed management plan on Nanaimo, but we've never done that. So we need to develop that methodology, which will be done hopefully this coming year, and that will inform our OCP review. And that's what our community members have been asking, and frankly, that's what First Nations are asking as well. They're saying, well, we want to return to the islands. We want to return home, as it were. These are their homelands, and so if we in our Gulf Island communities are talking about the pressure of housing and how are we housing our community members, well, we've got to have some science behind where we're going to put some housing and where we should not put it. So the water balance informs the land suitability analysis, which land is suitable for development and which is not.
And you've talked a lot there about how we don't have this, we don't know, but what I have been reading and hearing from people in other interviews I've done or seen brought up on columns are that there are issues already making an impact in people's lives when it comes to water availability. I've heard about trucks of water coming over from the island to Gabriola. Can you tell me about maybe the impacts this is already having?
Well, for instance, that's a great question. Before we had our ferry service increased to 2 ferries, so about 2 years ago, there was quite a drought and there was a real heat dome, and the water trucks were coming over constantly to Gabriola as people's cisterns weren't adequate for the demand. So many people were running out of water in May and June and July, whereas before they might have had a cistern that supplied their family for up until September when the rains come again. And so that's just because if we're getting less precipitation, there's no place for that water to go. There's no catchment areas, and the cisterns that people have bought and planned for their water use maybe are no longer adequate. And so the only way to refill those is to come and get city water, and there's a couple of service suppliers that do that. But that then increases. You've got large trucks with the ferry loads, you've got visitors coming over and lots of summer residents coming back. So the ferry lineups were extremely long a couple of years ago, and it was quite stressful. So rainwater harvesting and catchment is one solution, but it's not the total solution because you can only maybe have so many cisterns, and then you've got to refill them. But where do you refill them? There's nowhere on Gabriola to get that water. So it needs to be coming from the city. We don't have those piped in waters from watersheds. So thinking this through, there's lots of water available, but it's not being caught and used in the right way. So we can do a management plan that would include catchment areas, I think, and that's the plan for the water budget analysis and sustainability study.
So that is the reconciliation between the fact that there are struggles with water use already, and we've been talking a lot about adding more housing and more capacity for people to live on Gabriola?
Exactly. And it's great because we have the data already from these monitoring wells of how much water is being caught in certain areas. We don't have the data on where it's being evaporated or where community is using it. So that's what the water balance will do, is it'll produce this evidence-based methodology to understand how we can plan for the future. It's no longer, we can't use the plans of the past to plan for the future because, of course, climate change is impacting the amount of water in both the ground, and it's affecting how we have to understand the impacts of climate change in order to develop for the future.
Midcoast Morning. We'll be right back.
Midcoast Morning is made possible by the Community Radio Fund of Canada's Radio Meters program and listeners like you. Support Midcoast Morning and CHLY's nonprofit newsroom today by becoming a sustaining donor at chly.ca/donate. Local news can't survive without your support. Another way to help us out is to share this show with your friends and tell them why they should support us. Finally, if you're listening to the podcast edition of Midcoast Morning, go and give us a positive review on Apple Podcasts or whatever podcast feed you use. It helps people find us.
Today on the show, we're following up on the Islands Trust after their quarterly meeting last week in Nanaimo. The Islands Trust is a special form of government serving Gulf Islands in the Salish Sea. It was created by provincial legislation in the 1970s with a mandate to preserve and protect the environment and unique amenities of the Gulf Islands. Trust Council announced this week they've approved their annual budget. I'm speaking with Gabriola Island Trustee Tobi Elliot about issues impacting her community. Part of this big project, as well as a land use bylaw comprehensive review. What can you tell me about that aspect of things on Gabe?
Right. So just to back up a little bit, we've been through a visioning process. So getting everyone sort of warmed up to the idea that we can have input into our official community plan. It's not something that should be done to you, that we as a community are deciding what are the big things that we need to think about in terms of designing our community for the future. So the big themes that came through, of course, are protection of the natural environment, how do we develop in ways that are sustainable and sort of the built environment, and then our social network and community. We don't have services like other communities that are not islands. So those are the big sort of policy areas, and then we're going to drill down into what are the policies that will inform the land use bylaws. So this is the regulatory framework for how we live and build and move. There are some limitations, of course. We don't have control over our roadways necessarily. That's Ministry of Transportation. So the first part is the policy areas are going to be looked at. We'll have like a housing group looking at different policies, like do we want multiple small clustered dwellings in certain areas where it's been mapped out and we know that the land is suitable for increased intensity of living, or do we want to limit the number of large family homes on acreages, let's say, which consume resources, and they're wonderful, but it's that sort of a market-driven force that's already present, right? We want to increase the amount of the different types of housing and maybe limit some of the types of housing that are more intensive and cost the environment, because that is our mandate. We have to protect and preserve the environment, or what's the areas that are left. So getting into the policy areas, we've had to have sort of this visioning process to kind of get everybody together and warmed up to this idea that we are creating our community plan for the future and we have a say. And we're going to have a special event on this coming Saturday, March 23rd, and share out what we've heard through surveys and different community groups that got together to talk about what is important to them in their community plan for the future.
And what have you heard from folks so far?
Well, protection of the natural environment and groundwater resources is key. People really want to see that there's that we make sure that we decrease our impacts. We've seen that sort of the model we have right now of everybody building, a big family home and maybe a secondary dwelling is costing a lot. And so how do we mitigate that? Indigenous knowledge and incorporating Indigenous ways of knowing in our land use planning came through quite strongly, and climate change. Folks are very concerned about the drying, changing climate as we take down trees. The Douglas fir ecosystem is quite a dry one, and so as we take down trees, there's less evaporation, there's less water that comes down, and that's changing our terrestrial ecosystem. So how can we manage that? And then basically housing types and forms. I'm an advocate for tiny homes or small movable dwellings that aren't necessarily attached to a piece of land. And I think that's going to be important to introduce different options for people who are committed to their community, but they may not be a landowner or holder, right? So how can you have housing for folks that haven't been able to buy into property? And is
that something that's proven controversial on Gabriola Island, talking about different forms of housing or introducing different forms of housing?
I think people have lots of different perspectives on it. There's a very There's a network of barriers to having non-conforming houses considered legal dwellings, right? So you've got to work through all these regulatory pieces, hook them up to septic, make sure that there's that the density or the zoning for an additional dwelling is there. So that's the only way that we can regulate how people live and build, is through zoning and use. So you've got a parcel of land, it's zoned for one house and one accessory dwelling, let's say. If you add 2 or 3 dwellings, you're outside of that, your allowable use. And that's because you're adding to the population, you're increasing the amount of people using services and roads. And so regulating through how many houses are allowed, where do they go, and that they're hooked up to appropriate services, which well and septic is pretty much what we have on the islands. Those are the conversations that we need to work through, those challenges, in order to increase the different types and forms of housing.
At the public delegation section of the Islands Trust meeting last week, one of the biggest subjects was folks from, there was a delegation from Salt Spring, a group called Gulf Islands Alliance, who were worried about this interpretation or this policy document that came out last year that said that Trust Council's views that the phrase unique amenities in their mandate could be broad-ranging and could include housing and tourism and infrastructure. I'm just curious, what's your view on that situation and your response to some of the concerns various groups have raised?
Yeah, thanks for asking that. I think the term unique amenities has been pretty hotly debated since 1974 when the Islands Trust was first developed. And I kind of see it as we have a mandate from the province, and it has this terminology, but as communities develop and as our understanding of the landscape changes and the forces that we're working with, we interpret that differently with the context of our times. So, for instance, in 1986, there was a select committee that said, here are some of the characteristics of unique amenities, and one of those was a mild climate, over 500 islands, and unique rural, spread out parcels of land, forested areas that are contiguous, lots of forest cover. But that's changed. Our climate is changing. Folks have developed properties, and there's no longer a lot of contiguous forest. Certainly on Gabriola Island, we're challenged. We're losing a lot of the forest that is connected, and so how do we define unique amenities today? Well, so folks have determined that there was a consensus decision. We looked at a bunch of legal opinions on interpreting unique amenities, and did come up that people and communities are part of the uniqueness of the Gulf Islands as well. And the ways that our communities have developed, and it's really interesting because I get to see from Maine to South Pender, Thetis, Lasqueti, and Gabriola, where I live, the communities have developed in very different, interesting ways, and they are unique to those communities. So my personal view is that a unique amenity on Main Island may not be defined as the same way that a unique amenity on Gabriola Island. So that does include people. It does include patterns of settlement and tourism. But probably most significantly, and what's consistent across all the Gulf Islands, is the significant Indigenous cultural heritage sites. All of these islands were used really in significant ways for tens of thousands of years by First Nations. Some say up to 36 and 40,000 people lived in the Gulf Islands and moved around. And so there's significant cultural sites on every shoreline. There's middens everywhere. And so I would say that the one consistent, unique amenity that we really should be protecting and preserving is these areas that were significant for First Nations and still are. So I think it's open to interpretation for each time and decade. The world is changing, and we have to keep reinterpreting it. That's what the law does, right? You don't say that a word is just this meaning. As we learn and grow, the meaning changes for us.
What was behind maybe the action of seeking out legal advice about what a unique amenity is? Because I think a big part of the concern from people was just the idea that some of this was done at an in-camera meeting and they weren't sure exactly which trustee felt which way about the issue, or they couldn't see any kind of debate about this.
Right. Well, when you're a council of 26 trustees, you are going to have different opinions. But what we did do was one committee, the governance committee, looked at 3 different legal opinions that had been gained over the years, and that legal advice is not subject to the public. You know, we have this legal opinion, and you're allowed to go into a closed meeting to consider that. And so at this meeting on Pender Island, when the committee brought forward, here's what we looked at, here's these 3 legal opinions over the years, and they came to a consensus decision. We had a debate, and we all voted on, yes, we agree with this. And once council has voted and taken a position on something, that is council's decision. And it's really not fair to say, well, which trustee is for this or that, because then you're sort of inserting your personal druthers or bias. And we really want to have sort of a collective decision and put that question to rest. And so we were all quite satisfied that, yes, it's, I guess what's important to note is, and what's lost in the conversation, is that we decided that we need to balance all of these important areas. Infrastructure exists on the islands. We have roads, we have people, we have ecosystems, and we have First Nations cultural heritage that must be protected. And all of those important, unique amenities need to be balanced. You just need to consider them as you're doing your planning. You can't favor one over the other. You might, it's always going to be a debate. I'm not afraid of having criticism, but what I don't want to see is that individual trustees are cherry-picked and pitted against each other. That's just not fair. It was a council decision, and I think we're better for just coming out with a balanced view and not re-debating the question over and over again.
And at this stage, it's kind of an interpretation of something. How does that translate into impacting decisions, and has it in any way as of yet?
Right. Well, I guess the big debate is actually going to happen with our policy statement amendment project. The bigger picture is, so when a community like Gabriola, we're doing our official community plan review, none of our policies can contradict what the overarching policy statement for the Islands Trust as a whole states. In that policy statement, which is stale dated about 30 years, I believe, there is no mention of First Nations. There's no mention that these islands were and are home to First Nations peoples. And there's some significant omissions. Climate change isn't in there. So the bigger question, I think, is it's not unique amenities. It's how our policy statement is going to guide decision making into the future. And that has been sort of a 5-year project. There was a first draft that came out in 2021. And I think the big flashpoint was private docks. So just to give an example, the foreshore and nearshore is a multi-jurisdictional area, right? You've also got First Nations midden sites in significant areas. And so people building docks, when they have waterfront property, you have to get a foreshore lease. And it's not just an entitlement that every property owner gets to build a dock. So we may have to have a policy that says no new private docks. It's just not going to be allowed. And that is the conversation that's going to ignite that I'm not, I might be overcharacterizing it as controversial, but balancing private ownership rights with collective rights and underlying Indigenous rights is how we can arrive at a strong policy statement that respects everyone, puts all those rights into a balance.
Earlier on in our conversation, you mentioned there's going to be a public consultation on Gabriola Island this Saturday. What can you tell folks about that to encourage them to come out?
Yes, it's going to be exciting. Saturday from 1 to 4 p.m. at a venue called The Phoenix at the Haven. And so our planner, Narissa Chadwick, who's been working with us and designing the community engagement for the visioning so far, is going to share out the survey findings. So we did a big survey. What do folks want to see? The broad areas for our OCP. And we're going to have a conversation. Is there anything missing? And turn to one another and sort of do a little bit of a deep dive. There's going to be a graphic illustrator to capture the conversation and hopefully make a big, beautiful document that we can look back and say, this is our vision going forward for Gabriola. And I think there'll be cake and some music as well. It's a celebration of us coming together and sort of identifying the key ways that we want to live together into 2050.
Is there anything else you think it's important to bring to this conversation today?
Well, I would say that the Islands Trust is a very interesting but incredibly powerful instrument that I don't think we've really seen how well it can be used in service, not just for our communities, but for all of British Columbians. The relationship building that we're able to do now with First Nations, I was mentioning the policy statement earlier, we've had direction to give that draft to First Nations first and say, what do you think of this? What's important to you? What are the critical areas that you want to weigh in with us when we're considering land use planning into the future? And so we have some of that input now, and we're advancing the conversation with nations about what is governance going to look like in the Gulf Islands into the next 50 years. So as we're sort of the interface between the settled, non-Indigenous community members and First Nations who are wanting to exercise their treaty inherent rights and territorial rights to come and move and use the islands as they have formerly. And so the Islands Trust is, I think, we can set the table to have those conversations and develop the relationships between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples in the Gulf Islands. And that's the great asset that we have that we're going to be practicing and working towards in the next 50 years. What does governance look like in the Gulf Islands? And because we have this unique, special government to do that, we can move with some agency. And so I'm very excited about that. So if anybody has any questions or wants to reach out, I wear a couple of different hats, from regional planning to the Conservancy and all these local trust areas. I'm really happy to talk to anyone about the Islands Trust. It's a confusing beast. Some call it a unicorn and some call it a few other names. But I think it's just a fascinating form of government that has a lot of untapped tools that we could really start exercising.
Tobi Elliot, thank you so much for sitting down and doing this with me.
Thanks so much, Joe.
Tobi Elliot is a trustee representing Gabriola Island on the Islands Trust Council. That's our story for the day. Thank you for joining me. I'm Joe Pugh, host and producer of Midcoast Morning. Jesse Woodward is our executive producer, and RB Frew is our technical advisor. You can sign up for CHLY's newsletter at chly.ca/subscribe for updates from our nonprofit newsroom. Our theme song is First One by local Nanaimo band Waste Management. If you have a story you'd like us to cover, email us at news@chly.ca. That's all for now. I'll talk to you on another Midcoast Morning.
Midcoast Morning would not be possible without the funding of the Community Radio Fund of Canada's Radio Meters program and listeners like you. Midcoast Morning is a project of CHLY's nonprofit newsroom. Support nonprofit journalism in Nanaimo and on the Salish Sea today by becoming a monthly sustaining donor at $5 or more per month. Support the program at chly.ca/donate. If you're already a supporter, record a voice memo telling others where you're listening from and why they too should support our work. After you're done, you can email it to us. Also, share the podcast with your friends. While Meta is blocking Canadian users from sharing news content on their Facebook feeds, you can still share our podcast directly with your friends via Facebook or Instagram Messenger. Finally, this program acknowledges and gives thanks to the Nanaimo First Nation as we broadcast and podcast from their traditional territory. Thanks for listening.